Thank you for joining us for the next hour or two in this episode of Inside Myanmar podcast. In an age of nearly limitless content, we appreciate that you're choosing to take valuable time out of your day to learn more about what is happening in Myanmar. It's vital for this story to be heard by people around the world, and that starts right now with you. On this episode of Inside Myanmar podcast, we're joined by Elliott Prasse-Freeman, and we're going to be specifically discussing his book, which came out of many years of research and was just recently published. The book name is Rights Refused, Grassroots Activism and State Violence in Myanmar. Elliott, this is a long time coming. I'm really excited to get into this book. It's very full. There's a lot there. We'll see how much we can pack in. And thanks so much for taking the time to talk about your work.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So let's get into the book title itself, Rights Refused. I think that even the title of this is indicating somewhere of where you're going with your scholarship and what you're trying to express. Tell us what Rights Refused means.
Yeah, so it's a kind of play on words a little bit, in the sense that, as we know, anyone who's studied Myanmar for the past 60 years kind of understands that under a military government, rights in a sort of substantive sense, meaning the entitlements or the material things that could be given to people that we tend to call rights, have been refused or denied to the people of Myanmar. But what I have found over the last decade or so working on this book is that rights are more complex in Myanmar, in the sense that they tend to presuppose a contractual relationship, a stable relationship between a governed population and the apparatus of power that's supposed to be guaranteeing those rights. And that's something that their reality just doesn't reflect. And so when people do talk about rights in Myanmar, many Myanmar people, or at least this is what I found in my field work, look a little bit askance at that claim. So if someone says, you have the right to not have this happen to you, people might say, is that really true? They might look at their own material realities and say, I don't really think I have this right. And so the rights refused that I talk about in this book aren't just the fact that these rights are denied to people, but the paradigm in which we assume that rights is liberatory and can actually help people gain the things that they want and the dignity that they deserve. They might also refuse those paradigms. So it's kind of operating in two valences. One of the reasons why rights is so interesting in in Myanmar is that the Burmese term "akwinye," that is often translated as rights, can also be translated as opportunities. And I don't think this is an accident of language, in which in certain contexts it means rights and it's quite clear to everyone. In other contexts it means opportunities. So, for instance, "lu akwinye" means human rights, but "akwinye would mean opportunist, someone who takes advantage of a situation. So the root "akwinye" definitely points in two different directions.
Mm.
And over the term of the research, I kind of found that a concept that we tend to split and keep separate in other contexts. So maybe the one that I'm most familiar with as an American, in which opportunity is very different than a right,
Right.
um, haven't really been split in the same sense in Myanmar, both in terms of the reality that people live. And I think language tends to reflect that. So if someone doesn't have the opportunity to realize something, then they don't really have the right to it. And so I spent a lot of time tracking how people talked about this in their daily lives, and how activists had to maneuver a situation in which they couldn't rely on rights. They couldn't fall back on rights paradigms to guarantee or secure their incursions into the public realm against the military state. And so they had to improvise other methods that were effective for them.
Yes, and this is what we'll be getting into in this talk. And I just want to emphasize how important it is that we're looking at, and you specifically are bringing this to the readers, or in this case, listeners' attention, of not importing an understanding of from another country of how we've come to see it, and bringing that there, but trying to integrate where local paradigms and understandings occur. I think this is something that has happened all too often in the case of Myanmar. There's an anecdote that I've
Mm.
told several times before that's relevant here as well, where sometime probably 2012 or so, the year is important in the anecdote, 2011, I think it was, there was a Western trainer who came in to give a workshop, and part of the the talk and kind of what it hinged on was the ubiquity of Coca-Cola. And the whole talk hinged on just Coca-Cola being this ubiquitous thing that was available everywhere. And that the greater metaphor they were making, which I won't go into, it was pretty silly anyway, but it hinged on this understanding that Coke was this thing you could buy anywhere. But at that time in Myanmar, Coke was a luxury product. There was no Coca-Cola bottling plants. It was something you would have kind of at upscale places because it was imported from Thailand. And so it was this, like, if you went somewhere that had a Coke, it was kind of a sign that it was, a foreign product or something that was looked on in a bit more elite, a bit more expensive. And so there's so many incidences like this I encountered in my own life in Myanmar, but that was a moment I always glommed onto, because it really seemed to symbolize and highlight a foreign so-called expert coming in with an understanding of how things were in their country and maybe how they were in the world, and referencing an analogy without ever thinking to check if that was true there, and everything just falling flat because Coca-Cola in 2011 was not ubiquitous. So it's so important to know these local things and work within them rather than bringing your own paradigms and frames into it.
Yeah, that's a really great example. I can think about, a lot of the, I can think of similar situations that I've encountered in Myanmar as well. And I think the challenge when you're doing research on a place that can seem quite different, and it is quite different, is to figure out the ways in which a place like Myanmar is different, and take that local difference seriously, but also keep in mind the sort of ways that it's also connected to the broader
Right.
world. And so the
Right.
book tries to do that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And so getting into that book, I understand from your preface that your research began long before the coup, during the democratic transition period. And then in the midst of your research and your writing, the coup takes place. And so the way that one is confronting military oppression suddenly becomes much more acute in this moment. And so, how did that change the nature of your study and understanding to have done this research and have it, I want to say, interrupted by the military coup? I don't know if interrupted is the right word. It could be
Hmm.
enhanced and could bring out other things. But how did that change the way that you were digging into this?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It actually allows me to go back even further to the sort of origin of the book. In a sense, came back in 2003 and 2004 when I was just an undergraduate, and then I had finished my university and I moved to Myanmar at that point. So I lived in Myanmar in 2004 and five for about a year, a little bit more than a year, and so I got a sort of taste of what Myanmar was like before the transition. And then I did this. I finished. Um, I did a PhD work then a whole decade later, in which I started to study some of the things that I had seen in Myanmar a little bit more closely. And I think a lot of it emerged from the fact that Myanmar wasn't very well studied during the military years. And so there tended to be some tropes and some descriptions of reality that didn't match up to what I had experienced when I lived there. And so part of the reason for doing the PhD was just like kind of being, and this is kind of how I describe the my current profession in general, is kind of like being a nerdy detective. Like something doesn't seem that you read about Myanmar doesn't seem to match up with the reality that I had experienced living there in Yangon for a year. And so I was trying to figure out, or I was very compelled to try to figure out like what explained what really explained Myanmar. And so I was able to do this research during the so-called transition period, which for all of its faults did give researchers like myself a lot more freedom to move around the country and to explore things. And I was lucky enough, and so much of anthropological research, anyone who's honest will tell you, is just luck. I was working with a legal aid organization that actually collapsed due to some internal problems that it had. And so at this point, November, I think 2014, I was all dressed up with nowhere to go, so to speak. I had this fieldwork time, but I didn't have a great project at this point, and I managed to fall in with a NGO pal of mine who was doing land grab research in Mandalay and Sagaing area, and I tagged along and met the group of activists. And at that point, they had just been kind of hired as handlers because they knew these communities who were having their lands grabbed, and they were kind enough and generous enough to allow me to kind of tag along with them for what became the next few years, not all at once, but a sustained period of time for 8 months, 9 months with them, and then a longer term engagement with this group that continues to this day. That then led up to the coup, which of course I think most people speaking honestly will say that it took us by surprise. And then the coup, for all of its horror, produced this pretty amazing response, as we know on the ground, in the form of the uprising, or the Ayeda bone, however you want to describe it. And I started to notice so many of the things that I had been studying during that period of 2014 to 2021, basically, from the small to the large. And what I mean by that is like little things like the three-fingered salute I had observed in 2014 or 2015 in a courtroom in Dagon township in Yangon. And I started to see this everywhere. I had been
Mm-hmm.
studying these Jainza Daipwe, which were these cursing rituals that very cleverly use the sort of esoteric realm to kind of circumvent kind of secular realm domination, to tell people who are stealing land, you can steal the land all you want, but there's a longer term cosmological karmic consequence coming your way if you're not careful. And then during the coup, I was observing, dozens of these really creative cursing rituals pop up, even to the point that at the start of the coup, one of the few people who was arrested were not those protesters on the streets in the first couple of days, cursing at men online, but someone who led the people's cursing ritual, who was a Baden Saya in Mya Okalapa, was arrested. So it kind of showed the resonance for the people who were being cursed, in this case,
Mm-hmm.
the military junta. So the coup and the uprising against the coup was made legible by the research, or I tried to make it legible but through the research that I had done. And the coup itself and the uprising helped throw into relief and make a little bit more clear some of the things that I had studied. So the book is, because the coup is such an important, world historical event, and a huge one for Myanmar.
Hmm.
Um, I wanted to make sure that my book had focused in granular and specific ethnographic terms on much of the work that I'm sorry, much of the action and much of the things that had been done during this transition period didn't just become, old history, right? I wanted to make sure that the coup, which is in the uprising against it, which are still going on, are kind of in conversation with the what had gone on during the so-called transition period. And luckily, because the people who I had worked with were also in the streets and remain active in the underground resistance against the coup, provided a sort of bridge between the two eras and allowed me to write a book that at least speaks to both.
Right. Yeah, there's so much in that answer. I can only pick one direction to go at a time. I'm juggling between all the different things you threw there. But the thing I want to touch upon of what you said is that we have these touchstone moments in Myanmar that everyone pays attention to: 1988, 2007, 2021, just to name the last three. And I mean, even the years stand out with a certain. You just say those years, and anyone related to Myanmar in Myanmar knows exactly what you're talking about. And especially many outside observers try to understand Myanmar through these pivotal events and highlight them. But what stands out is your work. And I'm also thinking of Delphine Schrank, who wrote The Rebel of Rangoon. She was also on
Absolutely.
us with a podcast that I found, even though the direction that you two go are quite different in terms of your intentions. There's something very similar that I don't know if I've seen in many other books that are talking not about those touchstone moments, but about this, or about the big actors, but about the spaces in between and the smaller people on the ground that are giving shape to those bigger events in between them, and also supporting those bigger names that we know. And so I'm wondering if you also find this tendency to understand the country, attempt to understand the country through these big events. And when so much attention is being paid that way, what gets missed when further attention is not being paid to those moments when it appears that nothing is happening above board, yet actually so much is continuing to happen below the surface, which actually explain those big events when you miss them?
Absolutely. And I love that you brought up Delphine's book, because I really feel like it's one of those books that got missed a little bit. And I try to plug it whenever I can, because I think I read it back in 2015 or 16. I was really blown away by the sort of the detail and the
Mm-hmm.
nuance that
Mm-hmm.
she brings to things, and the sort of, like, just take the saffron revolution. Like, so many people repeat, even like many scholars repeat a lot of stuff about the revolution, that is just simply factually wrong about,
Mm-hmm.
you know they limit it to a discussion of the monks and miss the fact that the 88 GS was in the streets, walking to work because people couldn't take the buses anymore. And before that, this group called the Myanmar Development um, Committee, led by Tinjol and Goto and some of the other people who I mentioned in the book, had been holding protests before. So there's this long history that led up to this like conflagration that emerged. And so, the viewing from the outside, it seems like this was just a pent up aggression, not
Mm-hmm.
aggression, pent up frustration. Sorry, that popped off at this particular time and then receded back into stasis and complacency of living under military rule. But when you look at it from a sustained, on the ground perspective, especially from the perspective of grassroots organizers who are spending a lot of time in their communities rather than quote unquote in the streets, then you, as I said so eloquently, and I almost don't have that much to add, you start to see the sort of the ways that these broader conflagrations, these moments that we talk about from 88 to 2007 to 2021,
Mm-hmm.
can become a little bit more legible. I mean, I think one of the things that has to come through in the book is just how much of the life of an activist and a life of a normal person isn't about these contests with the state, quote unquote.
Exactly.
there's so much that is preparing for those, deciding when a
Hmm.
particular conflict, a particular protest is just, this is not our fight. This is not our time to go back to
Right.
prison, as I heard from them a lot. And there was a lot of picking and choosing and doing the organizing work that, that allows people to get from one day to the other, then also builds the sort of support and respect that then when things do come to a head, the people who have been wronged, whether they've had their land stolen or whether they are struggling to survive, or whether they're trying to organize a industrial zone protest, factory protest, then these activists aren't just the ones that had swooped in from above, but they've been working with them for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that when, as I'm hearing you talk, it's making me think or remember insights I had before with this. That when you just pay attention to those touchstone events, you're kind of minimizing and demeaning all the work that went into, this wasn't accidental. This was something that was not being paid attention to, especially by the West. But both yours and Delphine's book, in very different ways, are describing those the actors who dedicate their lives in ways that are maybe not as sexy or not as don't stand out in the same way, but that are in every way leading to something that is not accidental, that is maybe not predicted in the shape of when or how or what shape, but is certainly with a very intentional mind state to what isn't working and what can work in its place and what moments can bring about that change.
Absolutely.
Mm. And so another thing that you reference in your book, there's a number of phrases and words and terms to unpack. The first one I want to bring is you have this phrase, quote, left to die, made to live, made to die, left to live, end quote. But I wonder if you can unpack what this phrase means and where it came from and how it applies and is relevant to the underground that you're studying in Myanmar.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is getting into the hurly burly of the theory a little bit, and I hope the book doesn't drown in it in that sense, but uses enough ethnography to illustrate some of these concepts. So the let to die, made to live is actually comes from Michel Foucault's observations about changes in the way that power operated in the so-called modern period. So to kind of gloss this, the earlier era under quote unquote sovereign despotism or power was a situation where the king made people die when they threatened him, but for the most part, let them alone to live. And so he starts this book, Discipline and Punish, with a grisly scene of an execution in which someone had tried to kill, a regicide was being executed. And so he had this kind of interesting inversion of this kind of classic paradigm of the way we think power operates, and says that what actually is being happened is that we're the under what he called biopower ultimately, is that people are kind of let alone to die in certain situations and then made to live in the way that they're regulated, the way that they're enrolled into different projects, a way that they're the governed or trained and habituated into seeing themselves as certain kind of subjects, because as those subjects will live, they will allow the state and the broader apparatus to prosper. So he observed that this was a sort of interesting inversion in the way power worked in the world, or particularly the Western European world that he was studying. Now, what the reason why this is relevant for my work in Myanmar actually is multiple fold, I think, and it's a kind of a question of where to start sometimes. So I'm going to start with going back to the rights point, in the sense that when the rights paradigm kind of assumes an individual autonomous actor who stands in a relationship to the state as a contractual rights bearing subject who has one vote and who grants the people who are or institutions that are ruling him that the right to rule through the legitimacy of that particular relationship. Now, anyone who's studied Myanmar knows that is not really a good way to describe how things operate in Burma. Just from the fact that we don't, for a long time, didn't even have elections, but just the fact that usually people aren't seen not taken as the sort of foundations for the way governance should operate, unfortunately. And that's why I think a lot of activists will talk about power to the people as a way of reinstalling something that hasn't existed. So we need to get outside of the sort of liberal paradigm that assumes a rights-bearing subject. And so Foucault provides this alternative paradigm in which people are mobilized or are regulated not as individuals per se, but as part of these population groups who are then let to die or made to live in the classic sense. And so there's a theorist called Partha Chatterjee, who is an anthropologist at Columbia, who studies the so-called post-colonial world. And he kind of argues that because of the way that the colonial world took individuals, or it's governed not as individuals to be regulated through the paradigm of civil society and one person, one vote that I just described, but rather as those sort of masses, those population groups to be regulated. In a sense, all politics in the post-colonial world are to a certain extent fall under this biopolitical paradigm in which people mobilize as population groups. Now, I found that to be very insightful for a place like Myanmar, and I started to think about the ways that this set of theoretical tools could apply to a place like Burma. And I think what I found is that while one could describe the things in Myanmar as the regulatory governance paradigm in Myanmar as biopolitical, that also somehow gets things wrong a little bit because it overstates the way that biopolitics tends to want to make live. And that goes back to that expression that you mentioned earlier, the let to die, made to live. And so I was really quite fascinated by this theoretical conundrum, which is that how can you have a sort of biopolitical paradigm in which masses are taken as the objects of governance rather than, rights-bearing liberal individuals, but they're not promoted in the sense that their lives are not protected. They're not made to live in a way that it seems like is a concern of of the state. And so I then inverted this expression one more time. Instead of let to die, made to live, I kind of saw something in Myanmar as more like let to die, made to die. And what I mean by that, without sounding too macabre, is that population groups in Myanmar are either made to die in the sense of, perhaps protesting masses, the Rohingya and other ethnic minorities who have been the object of direct state violence over the last 60, 70 years, are then also exist in the same context with population groups of what we might call, kind of unmarked average Bama populations who are more let to die, who are just kind of ignored and who are not made an object of governance in an active way. And the reason why I wanted to focus on that is going back to, my origin story in a sense where I felt like things that were written about Burma weren't really accurately describing the reality that I saw, is that there's often an assumption that Myanmar state is totalitarian, that it operates in this insidious way where it seeps into every, aspect of people's lives. And when I lived in Myanmar and spent a lot of time talking with Burmese people, I just didn't see that as a reality. Like the state was really horrible and did terrible things, but often it was a form of neglect as much as it was an active form of meddling. And of course, you don't want to get caught up in the state because it, to kind of paraphrase a Burmese expression, you don't want to make small problems big problems. At the same time, I think even the way that some scholars describe the relationship between the Myanmar state and its subject populations through the paradigm of evasion maybe misdescribes things a bit. And I'm not like dunking on people who use evasion. I've used it too. But I started to think about evasion, and evasion kind of describes, it only really works. You can only evade something which is trying to capture
Yeah,
you, which is
right.
trying to enroll you, which is trying to regulate you, which is trying to surveil you. And spending time in the what I call, well, not what I call, but what is it's called the Sinjebon, the sort of peri-urban areas of Yangon. And I use that term because the activists I work with spent time in Mount Okalapa, but also down Dagon and
Hmm.
Shripita and Langtaya. So it was kind of a movable feast across
Mm,
these peri-urban areas. And one of the problems was not a state that was suffocating people, but a state that was just completely absent. And so
hmm.
you have these, you know, not so much two populations of those who are let to die and made to die, because different individuals can move between them, unfortunately, with with rapid speed sometimes, but rather sort of different paradigms of rule. That there are different. That this is a sort of the logic in which some people become this direct object of violence, and other people become a sort of object of what we could call like structural violence,
Hmm.
violence of neglect. And one of the challenges of the activists was to take um, this reality and kind of politicize it, take this um, structural violence. That one of the tricky, insidious parts of structural violence is the way that it convinces people that it is normal, and maybe not quite so normal that they
Hmm.
think that it is just, but they think that it is not something that can be intervened against. And so a lot of what the activists were doing was taking a look at normal material conditions and trying to re-signify them, right? To say this is not just something that is banal, that is like that defines daily life and must, but it's something that could be done differently. And here's how we might imagine that.
Right. That's really insightful. And you do describe this kind of alternating view between the state having like either this ghostly quality of neglect or this aggressive, overbearing nature of overt violence. And it's really a distinction between complete absence and assertive presence. And noting that how the regime only recognizes people when it harms them. I mean, that's quite a tragic statement to understand. And I think perhaps very hard to make sense for those who are listening to this from stable societies to even kind of contemplate what that means to live in a society like that. And that brings up another term that I think it segues naturally into another term you present in the book. You've already referenced the term biopolitics. I think first, maybe unpack biopolitics for those listeners who aren't familiar, but then you add an adjective onto that, blunt biopolitics. And so in this nature of characterizing what this regime is, what it isn't, what it means to live under it, what it means to resist against it, what is the relevance of this this blunt biopolitics, and what does that mean in terms of how it manages life and death, how it deploys violence, how it uses knowledge?
Thanks. Yeah, that's a really good question. And thank you for reading so carefully, that you're able to chaperone this conversation in such a sophisticated way, probably more than I deserve, especially when I come up with terms like blunt biopolitics that still make me cringe a little bit. But what I mean by blunt biopolitics is that, so I saw the way that, if we're operating outside of this rights-based paradigm, a biopolitical paradigm in which I think its very basic sense uh, describes the way that population groups rather than individuals are regulated. But then in the Foucauldian sense, the things that he was observing in Western Europe, he observed different kind of like axiomatic definitions, or sorry, elements of what biopolitics would look at. And the kind of key is that, I think two main keys is that the population groups that are taken as the object of governance are also protected and promoted. And so life itself becomes this object to enhance, so that the broader polity can flourish. And so he observed, this is Foucault, observed things like censuses and public health administrations and productivity projects that then take an average sort of regulated subject as part of these populations and tries to enhance them. So things that hadn't been objects of knowledge before, the ratio of births and deaths, the sort of how much people could be improved, these became objects of governance itself. Now, blunt biopolitics, even though I think, people can definitely argue against this, I argue that in Myanmar we're operating under a sort of biopolitical paradigm. There's some key deviations from the way that biopolitics operates. First, quite simply, the population groups aren't actively protected, actively promoted in the same way that the sort of paradigmatic model of biopolitics would suggest. So the population groups don't become sort of recipients of active interventions on the part of the broader state apparatus that would try to promote them. And one of the reasons, or sorry, so something that operates kind of like dovetails with this is that in part because the populations aren't actively promoted, they aren't really known. And I think one of the things that I'm trying to intervene against is a use of the biopolitical and Foucauldian sort of governmentality argument that occurs in many other parts of the post-colony that I think has been a little bit blithely transposed to the Myanmar context. And what I mean by that is that especially in the historiography and analysis of India under the British, you saw these really ambitious projects of knowing the local population so as to better regulate them through things like ethnological surveys and censuses and ways of taking, old laws and trying to make them real as the original Orientalists were doing there. And because Myanmar was a part of British India until 1937, people kind of assume, well, same colonial project, same outcome, and hence you hear a lot about how the census in Burma reified ethnicity and turned it into these, ossified categories that people cannot no longer maneuver within, and it becomes their destiny. But doing field work and watch, paying attention to the way the state operates, it seemed like that form of knowledge power was more or less absent in Burma. And so to just give some pretty basic examples, like one of the key features of statecraft is knowing your population so you can regulate them. But Myanmar is a country that doesn't have a biometric ID system. It has these Mapon-Tin, these ID cards that it insists people carry, but the census of 2014 showed that many people don't actually even have these things. So so people aren't very well regulated. They don't even have last names, of course, quite famously, which James Scott and others have shown is not an accident of history, but rather a technology of governance. So lineages can be traced and individuals can be tracked down by the state when needed. And even that census that I just mentioned, the 2014 one, was the first one that had been held since 1983, which in turn wasn't a very complete one. And so there was another one in 1973, and there wasn't one before that, for a while. So that, the way that Myanmar is known is very incomplete. And so as a result, this throws into relief how we can think of the state. And it also has consequences for how people imagine their own lives. So because the state doesn't exhaust this realm of regulation, you have people able to reimagine even the categories through which they are governed. And so I think one of the more important examples is that in a country where scholars often talk about the importance of lumyo, the Burmese term for, you could say, race or ethnicity, even has been kind of remade on the ground, which you wouldn't think is possible if the state was robust, proactive, insisting on certain categories and making them real in people's lives. So as an example, if you ask someone about Lumiole, what Lumio are you? You're, depending on who you are asking and depending on how the person in turn interprets your question, you can get really different answers. And one of the answers that I found most interesting is, how often people returned, and I found this in the literature too, so it wasn't just me, answers about religion to a question that was putatively about race or ethnicity. So when I asked about Lumiole, people would say, Hindu Lumio, Muslim Lumio, even Bota Bata Lumio.
Mm-hmm.
And the Bota Bata one, I think, is the most, Buddhist Lumio, rather. I think that one's probably the most interesting because for marginalized subjects like Hindus and Muslims in Myanmar, they don't often have races that are available in the famous 100 list of 135.
Yeah, right.
And one of the tragedies is the way that in the last 60 years, some of their Lumios were actually stripped from the list. There's an article by Mufti Miantain where he shows that there were 144 Lumio, and many of those Lumios disappeared and went to 135 that we now know is the key number. Now, what's interesting about Buddhist people saying I'm a Buddhist Lumio is that they have those, for the most part, they have those categories available to them, but the state hasn't insisted that they identify with one and only one. As Benedict Anderson, the famous historian in Southeast Asia, he said, one of the things about the modern state and the census is that it made sure people no longer saw themselves as fractions, no mixed identities. He said that the key of the census wasn't so much that it created new identities, but it forced people to choose between a world that had been really fluid beforehand. Now, I see a lot of that fluidity still on the ground. And if you look at people's Mapontin, that card that I suggested earlier that, a lot of people don't even have, you'll see, especially for Muslim people or people who seem like they come from South Asia as ascribed by the physiognomy that immigration officials will see in them, you will see like a huge number of fractions. You'll see a Lumio with written in hand, scrawled on there that says, Muslim, Bengali, Pakistan, and then maybe like Kaman or something else. And so as a result, you don't have this very aggressive regulatory apparatus that is taking an active role in people's lives. So to come back to that blunt biopolitical point, the state is basically given way to the polity to help kind of like regulate itself. And I think a lot of important ethnographic work that is emerging in this period of the transition where people are actually able to go study how people live is showing all these really interesting improvisational go-to go-da, as Gerard McCarthy in his recent book studies the way people are forced to kind of support themselves. And so I don't know if I would go so far as to call this a biopolitics, because it doesn't, it's not quite that all-encompassing and well-organized. But under a blunt biopolitical paradigm, people are not like all left to their own devices. There are these interesting ways that people are supporting each other. But one of the challenges becomes to try to make that more political. And a lot of the book is arguing that the way that people have to take care of their own sort of like biopolitical survival as these population groups can then become the sort of gateway drug, if you will, into becoming more political. That almost everyone starts out in these civil society organizations, from free funeral services to local education projects. Then, if we're lucky, they become radicalized and politicized at some point, and they start to turn these things into objects of politics and objects of organization that say, well, this doesn't have to be this way. So finally, to sum up, to finalize blunt biopolitics, there's a sort of third arm or third aspect to it, which is that if you have a state that doesn't promote its populations, which doesn't really know them, it also, this would imply that it's just basically not there. And one of the things that you identified a couple minutes ago is that this isn't quite the way to describe the state either. That while I emphasized some of its absence, it also can be radically present in the sense of,
Mm-hmm.
committing genocide and a coup, some of the most sovereign acts imaginable.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to kind of think about the way that violence can become a sort of governance technique. And that emerges from a lot of the work or research that I've been doing over the last 5 years since completing my dissertation and moving to Singapore. I've had a lot of more chance to work with the Rohingya community on that very tragic situation of the ethnic cleansing that occurred in 2017 and the long-term attempt to erase the population from northern Rakhine State. But one of the things that's really fascinating about this conflict, and I want to be very careful here, not to say that until the violence occurred, Rohingya didn't exist, but I would say that I not stumbled upon, but found a remarkable number of people who weren't aware of the ethnonym Rohingya until they became an object of mass violence on the part of the state that was trying to eliminate the Rohingya.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this sort of brutal irony that the very mass violence that was trying to eradicate the mass actually helped give the mass a new consciousness around it. And this is a sort of points to the way that violence itself can be productive of those same population groups that I was describing as paradigmatic of a biopolitical way of regulating a population.
Right. And other examples you give in the book of this kind of, for lack of a better word, hide and seek of either neglect or overt violence is how in the early days of the coup, the SAC was sometimes displaying the bodies in their full glory and sometimes hiding and disposing of them in secret. And just in general times, also the fact that people must find a way to access goods and services from the state or by their own means while preventing harm from the state in return, which is just insane. And your talk just a minute ago about how moving from being involved in some aspect of civil society into and then having that as a gateway that goes into greater political life, that actually it's really interesting because that echoes what came up in a previous podcast conversation with former U.S. Ambassador Scott Marcial, where at one point he was arguing in the podcast representing a view that he was bringing to Washington in describing that some of the forms of engagement and democracy and civil society and such, in Myanmar they took on a life and a character that didn't necessarily fit international development models. And so he was really arguing in American engagement to support certain kinds of civic engagement and civil society that did not fit democratic models of what they were used to seeing. But he was arguing this is the shape it has to take. And if I remember correctly, I think we might have been talking specifically about post-Nargis and, Nargis, that was obviously a really important time. And I was there. I saw it literally happening in front of me as a trainer at the American Center. I saw students or participants in the courses that I was leading responding to that emergency that was happening in their civil society with no other intentionality than simply how do we get medicine or rice or whatever else has to be done. And then from there, that growing to greater agency and confidence and networking and other things. And so, but it's just interesting hearing you say that from a more academic side, which parallels so much of what Scott Marcial was describing from a diplomatic side, and just an emphasis in having this be on the radar. I think that you could also harken back to the Coca-Cola example that, yes, you need to have international models that can be applied and that are useful and that are relevant, but then you also need to know damn well that there's no Coca-Cola bottling plant in Myanmar. And Coca-Cola might be ubiquitous and might be a sign of capitalism in 98% of the countries in the world, but at that time Myanmar was not one of them. And so that's why it's so important to be able to correlate and bring those international models into the particular reality, the peculiar reality that you find in Myanmar, and understand what's manifesting, so your either your policies or your studies or your engagement or whatever it is, in my case, it was training, it was education, are fitting into understanding what the context actually is, and not what the models or the academics or the policies are telling you it should be.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I love that you brought up Nargis and that sort of context, because this is kind of, I also worked the recovery in Nargis. I had a active tourist visa. I was living in Bangkok at the time. I had left Myanmar in 2005, but I still went back to visit friends, and I had a plan to go back to visit friends, and they weren't letting real humanitarians in at the time. And so I called up my old boss at UNDP and I said, could you use me? And he basically said, well, you're better than nothing. So I hopped on a plane and I spent the next month in Yangon working on early recovery programs for UNDP, and and started to notice exactly this much discussed and observed point, which is that the civil society kind of came into its own in these moments of crisis. And one of the sort of mild amendments that I make there is that I think civil society was kind of always there. We just weren't really able to see it. And so when there was a crisis like this, and this actually goes back to some of the themes we talked about at the very start of the podcast, is that, if you are training your eyes on the ground, you can actually see things that are probably there the whole time. And so what is really interesting about these civil society groups is the way that they were able to kind of shapeshift and go from being like a group that focused on funeral services, or we're a group that gets together to make music, and suddenly a crisis hits, and we're like, well, we already have the sort of, to use a term I don't love, the social capital. We have the trust network. We are able to work together, and so we can do some things that other people can't. Why don't we, direct that to different ends? And I think what's really fascinating about the civil society angle is how much of the things that I observed and that were explicitly political had kind of emerged from the sort of the training that had come through working in non-politicized contexts. So whether the sort of local organization that I track in the book called CDI kind of like slowly incorporates young people into their projects and trains them on how to act in public, to the sort of Jainza Daipwe, which I was talking about earlier, which I had assumed was some esoteric ritual designed by a monk in the forest in central Burma. And I'm a little bit ashamed at my presumptions. And I'm in Monywa area in Lepadown, the site of this major protest against this copper mine, and I'm asking the activists, can I talk to them, whoever is responsible for that? And they start smiling at me, and I immediately know I've stepped in it. I immediately know I've done something wrong. And they look back at the guy who had been there the longest, the city slicker from Yangon. He sheepishly admits that he was the one who came up with this idea, because he had worked for Free Funeral Service before, and so had kind of knowledge of these esoteric rites that other people didn't, and hence could improvise within this sort of cosmological paradigm to design these cursing rituals. And so I thought, here, even in these things that seem so different than kind of, civil society daily survival, you see the connection between activism and I guess we could say like communities supporting themselves.
Of course, the whole, kind of Protestant Buddhism movement that came out, and the mindfulness movement that came to Burma, there was this really awkward dichotomy that was of wanting to, both in terms of the Western teachers that were bringing it, as well as the Burmese teachers that were wanting to present it as something that was fit for the modern world, wanting to describe it as this scientific, rational, logical endeavor. But of course, there are all these things popping out of it. And even some of the early Buddhist scholars, they categorized like a real distinction between the more supernatural parts, and then the traditional practice and Vipassana fitting in there as well. But one of the more recent developments of the study of Burmese Buddhism is that this distinction, these walls that these early scholars built, that were probably in line with the way the teachers are being represented, that the supernatural elements are all involved in every part of it. And I think that this is one of the misunderstandings that comes from outside observers looking at Myanmar, is trying to build those walls, those categories, put things in different places, and not realize how it's all running together. And when there's a discomfort with Buddhism or meditation or the supernatural, the supernatural parts of this or that, it might be tempting to say, well, I'm not so interested in this, and I'm not really looking at this so much, but I'm just looking from this angle and at these things. Well, that discomfort is going to come out in a jarring way, in really obscuring and preventing an understanding of how this is fitting into common parlance and daily life, and just integrating in many Burmese experiences with, where all these things fit together. You can't take one thing out that you're uncomfortable with or that doesn't make sense and then try to understand the other, because you're always going to be playing catch up. And so it's just an insight, bringing this background to what you just said. It's an insight that I'm just thinking of, that that you have this incredible interplay of the of where this cursing practice is coming from, and what this might mean in a supernatural or a Buddhist context. But then what does it mean? How does that being understood? And then what does it mean when you're putting into an anti-regime activity or a protest, or having agency or resistance? And where do all these things come together? And if there's not that appreciation or comfort with where those supernatural beliefs are coming and how they're being understood, then there's also not going to be a solid understanding of where they fit into something very worldly, democratic, political. And so this is where I'm always hitting at on the podcast when I talk, is whether you're coming in from an angle of human rights or politics or ethnic rights or Buddhism and meditation and spiritual endeavors, whatever it is, and that's what you care about. You can't just take one piece out of the Myanmar equation and say you're just going to understand this, because you end up with such an incomplete understanding that nothing's going to make sense.
Now, there's a lot there that I want to pick up on. I mean, one of the things that on a basic level is even the question of like belief, it gets a little bit tricky, and is that sort of binary that I think you're also critiquing. And one of the things, like in other words, like do you believe in ghosts? Do you believe that the cursing will actually curse them to many hells in their future life? And I think if we pay attention to the way that Myanmar people talk about these things, it gets even more complicated, or kind of like breaks down that binary between whether you believe or not. And there's a part in the book where I'm observing people talk about the Chainsaw Daipwe that occurred against Min Online during the coup. And there's this, an online commentator put it, he said, I'm translating, I don't believe at all in all of this cursing, this yada yada stuff relating to past lives, but if it will hurt the dictators, I will follow it believingly. And I love that line, because it speaks to the fact that what matters isn't really the belief, but how you act. Do you in this case, he's acting as if he believes it is the same as believing it, because it creates this sort of field of joint attention around this object. In this case, the cursing of Min Online, whether he can be shamed, and everyone's paying attention. And I think people, like when I was observing these cursing rituals, and I was unfortunately kind of trying to figure out, like, well, do people actually believe this? And it took a while to kind of deconstruct my own paradigms of analysis. And Goto, the main interlocutor in this book, he put it really well. He basically said, like, look, this is not about really belief or not, but it does make you feel a certain way. And that sort of return to the way that it actually created sort of structures of feeling, as I think Raymond Williams put it, is as important in, sitting someone down and interrogating them about whether they actually believe. And I think that speaks to the sort of efficacy of these rituals, and as a sort of weapon of the weak, in a situation where it's hard to come right out and demand things from a state that it tends to ignore you and hasn't given you any rights, so to speak, when you can impact their potential future lives, no matter
Hmm.
how much protective magic they do, there's still that sort of concern that the temporality that they're existing in right now, or appear to be existing in right now, of sort of secular realm domination,
Hmm.
might not be relevant to these future lives. And so they're, I heard people kind of imply, like, what the ritual does is it says you can take the land, you can coup if you want to coup, but you can never eliminate this curse. There's sort of this theme of haunting that exists in the book, in which these other trajectories, these other potential ways of living, when exist as a sort of as ghosts of that haunt the present. And this kind of speaks to this other theme in the book. It goes back to the title of refusal, in which resistance, as I theorize it in the book, tends to kind of focalize these direct contests of sovereign power, where these two entities, the activists and the state, square off. But given that those kind of contests can lead to annihilation in a state or in a military that doesn't really care about the terms of engagement, where
Hmm.
it's not pistols at dawn, it's we will absolutely destroy you. And as a result, you have this sort of mimesis, this mimicking of the way that the state operates as both absent and present, is also the
Hmm.
way that the activists have to be present. They have to then presence the state through those actions to try to get this absent state to actually materialize, so that they
Hmm.
can make their demands. But then they often have to dematerialize. They have to evaporate
Yeah.
into nothing, lest they get destroyed.
Yeah, and that then connects back to the early thing we said about how a lot of outside attention is paid to the moments of appearance and of manifestation, and that's really ignoring all the stuff between the spaces and under the surface that we're highlighting here. But I also want to go to the cursing. That is, you talk a lot just now about how in trying to measure and understand the belief system of those that are enacting the curses. What can you say about the targets of those curses? To what extent did you find that we know that the military regime has long been just insanely superstitious in terms of its policies and its and how it's conducted itself to ensure its survival? To what extent do we find that that their fear of the curses is based on a real fear of what will happen in the afterlife or in future lives in other realms? And to what degree is it more worldly, in the sense of, well, if these people believe it, then just by them believing it, it becomes a thing. We have to be strong and stand against it and show our power in resisting and crushing it down.
Great question. I think one of the things the book doesn't do is provide actually any real insight into the sort of consciousness or reflection on the part of military leaders, just because I didn't have that kind of access. And so it's all mediated through the people who I did spend a lot of time with, and was asking, okay, so how do you think that the military is taking this? And one of the things that's kind of funny about, sort of, can the subaltern speak, or can these rituals that seem like they're coming from peasants actually penetrate the elite realms of generals, is that we suspect that there is kind of a shared cosmological understanding of the way that the world might work in terms of future lives, and what will happen to people. And the way that we know this is by looking, not interviewing Min online and asking him what he thinks, although that would be great, but rather just kind of adducing, kind of like taking the evidence from how they respond to these rituals. And in Leopardon, which I think kind of like improvised this repertoire of contention that then spread to the rest of the country and was picked up during the coup, or at least that's kind of what I suggest in the book. It's hard to say that for sure. The way that the activists were then, you know, connected with by the objects of their cursing, whether they were the local head of the company, or whether they were the local commanders who were in charge of some of the more repressive actions against monks, suggests that these things were resonating. If you didn't care about them, you could just allow the people to do their silly ritual and then and then continue your domination. But the activists were getting back channel messages saying, we don't deserve to be cursed like this, and my wife is very concerned, so like blaming it on the wife, and this is very shameful for us. And so this point of shame is interesting too, because it speaks to the fact this is a sort of public political event that matters as much as it is a potential like cosmological one that has resonance on, redounds upon your future lives. No, this is very much like a public shaming
Yeah.
that is particularly sophisticated and effective because of the way that it does that shaming. So rather than using the idioms of the secular, and as we know, the quote unquote secular is always shot through with the sort of what we might otherwise categorize as cosmological, like this, the supposed West is imbued with its Christian foundations, and in Myanmar you have a sort of Buddhist governmentality, one could argue, and I think that so while the sort of messages that had just been like, it's bad, we have rights to this land and you shouldn't steal it. Well, the regime could say, well, where are your rights when we steal the land? But when they use these other idioms and they speak more to justice, a sort of almost karmic universal justice, it becomes something that's harder to ignore. So in the sense that, the Michongan protest that was one of the ones I didn't study as directly in this book, but was the occupation of Mahabandula Park by a group of people who had had their land stolen out in Dinganjun, if I'm not mistaken, and who lived in this Debatesakan, this sort of protest camp for almost over a year, if I'm not mistaken, in 2014 and 15. I asked them about their chainsaw that they were doing, that I think they had learned from the people in Leopardon. And they said it's kind of like a trial. It's like, if we are lying, then we're going to be cursed as well. So they're kind of like creating a sort of publicly staged ritual that, in a country that had the Dea Ubere Somoye, the rule of law that we hear so much about, that, is intoned by Aung San Suu Kyi so often, a sort of ritual, a sort of public trial could actually adjudicate on these things. But because they didn't have any trust in those institutions actually hearing them out, they kind of created their own and put their own skin in the game and said, like, this is not just us wielding the spirits against the military and the people who stole our land, but we're subject to it as well. And so it's a sort of a test of who's telling the truth and who is not. And I thought that was a pretty brilliant way of creating politics out of in a situation that tends to deny people access to the institutions through which we think politics can be done. And so the brilliance of the chainsaw is the way that it really does call people into action. Into consideration that they might be being cursed. And this is where I talk about, like, how do you bring a weapon of the weak out into the open? How do you, if you know that yelling at someone is going to lead to harsh reprisal of the annihilation that I spoke about earlier, and where keeping it between you and your buddies in the village isn't going to do much either? How do you bring this sort of weapon of the weak into the open and make sure it's still effective? Well, you do it by kind of tricking people into participating in it, into feeling called by it. And so I call this sort of interpellation from below. Interpellation, another perhaps needlessly fancy word, that it talks about that moment when you feel called, like when the policeman says, "Hey, you," and you turn around because you think that you is you, which is an idea brought forth by this guy named Althusser, tends to be what we think of as top down. The policeman is a member of the state, but interpellation can happen from lots of different places. Otherwise, how would we ever have social change, as Judith Butler, I think, really smartly points out? And so in this case, these chainsaw daipways are these like subtle ways of getting people or encouraging people to see the conditions differently. It's like, you think you're proceeding on a path of righteousness, and you can build lots of pagodas with the money that you've stolen from the people. But what if you're being judged karmically in a different way? And we're reminding you to maybe consider that. And so the chapter I have on the curses also shows, through Burmese political cartoons, a lot of this same sort of paradigm of interpolation, where elites end up finding themselves called to see themselves differently, and maybe to even to be different. And I think that shows one of the many different ways that activism and protest has to happen in a place like Myanmar, where the kind of standard imaginaries of how protest plays out, though they can exist too. And a lot of the book is showing activists doing pretty brave and courageous things, directly speaking truth to power. But there are also situations where that just doesn't work, and different methods are necessary, where you have to coax and cajole people who might otherwise be your enemies to start to see you as a comrade. You have to coax and cajole people who are a part of this apparatus of the state to let you do your thing. And you have to maybe try to coax and cajole generals to see what they're doing in a new light.
There's a lot there, and it's also making me think of a couple other terms you use, as well as some of my own background and experience in Myanmar. I'll try to see where I can bring all these together, but it's really coming from a place of understanding two things coexisting. I mean, one is this lack of trust in state institutions, which I think really cannot be overemphasized enough for those that have grown up in countries where, however much we like to complain about them and however much there are genuine flaws in them, if you're in a place with more or less functioning state institutions, it's very hard to imagine what it's like to live in a society without them if you haven't done. It's conceptually, it's very, very difficult. And I don't know how many years I had to live in Myanmar before, and having frustrations that I would just complain about and be bothered with before I began to realize the institutional nature of what was happening. And then sometimes guiding other foreign friends that were there into hearing their frustrations and putting it in the context of their privilege of coming from places with functioning state institutions. But having that as one shade of understanding, and another shade of understanding being the for lack of a better word, like kind of the traditional Burmese Buddhist background and some of the beliefs and practices that have gone into that, and where these come together, and just to throw out some of the terms you use, and then to correlate some of past podcast conversations I've had, as well as my own experience. One term you use is the azani, which is like a sacrificial figure, and that there very much is a kind of correct way to sacrifice. And you put this in context, interestingly, both of among communist communities and Buddhist communities, both of whom can demand the right way to sacrifice, the right way to be sacrificial, to lead an austere life. And this also goes into, we had one podcast guest we had on, Philip Anawit, talked at length about the culture of sacrifice that he was seeing in the NUG, and how he was commenting that the degree of sacrifice that one had, he noted that the degree of sacrifice that one had almost became a currency for the leadership and appointments they would have going forward. And certainly, in my experience of seeing of Burmese friends and reading history of different great monks and meditation teachers, that and just Burmese history in general, that there is this sense that I've seen repeated time and again, that when facing a difficult situation, whether societal, community, or individual, that falling back on a vow of truth, of something that you can, which I actually find in a personal and spiritual sense, I find incredibly inspiring what a vow of truth can be. And the way I've seen it play out is that you look at what in your life has been noble that you can claim as absolute truth. The greater nobility you can righteously claim, the more protection you're going to have. But even if it's something, what I found so inspiring from my time around Burmese Buddhists is that this vow of truth can be the things that we wouldn't even think of, or I wouldn't even think of as wanting to claim, as something like like, yesterday I did not kill any mosquitoes, or this week I have not told
Yeah.
a lie, or whatever you can cling to, whatever you can say, or I have given, $5 at a donation ceremony and I did this with a pure heart. And if these vow of truths can be stated, and that there's not a shade of a variance of what you're vowing that truth for, this can then be built upon another term, which is the Yangmie, the land of victory, which a
Yep.
land of victory can be anything from wanting to do well on a test or get a job promotion to, wanting to win a victory against a conquering enemy. And so it's this kind of resting back and falling back on this on this sense of sacrifice. Sometimes, as the conversation with Philip Anawit developed, sometimes recognizing that the sacrifices being made were actually not very effective or appropriate for the goal that
Yeah.
wanted to be achieved, but it was simply a mindset that I have to sacrifice, I have to show, I have to be a figure of sacrifice and sacrifice the right way, and falling back on nobility, taking a vow of truth of, what kind of sacrifice or nobility one can righteously cling to, and having it, and having the land of victory where this is then claimed. And then the final term to throw into this cocktail that you bring up is pia, the charisma and attracting the followers, the having, which is everything from having a clean and sweet smelling body to,
Yeah.
to just, which, in a Burmese Buddhist context, to me just brings up so much of karma. I mean, all of this is understood in karma and conversations I've had, that, how charismatic you are, and how, and everything from body odors to intelligence to, what doors open to you. I know this is a hodgepodge of things that I'm
No.
throwing. I think where I'm trying to go with bringing this all together is, this is coming back to this lack of institutions that you can trust. So if you can't trust these institutions, what can you trust? You can vow of truth. The most powerful thing about a vow of truth, and the way I've seen it enacted, is that there's kind of nothing greater in this world than a vow of truth in an action which you claim with a sense of power and righteousness that is true, that no one can take away from you, which then creates kind of a hyper morality protection that allows you to be successful in your endeavors going forward. And so, it's not, I think it's not the sense that these characteristics have manifested based on a lack of institutions, because I think they predate when these institutions came about. But I think that given an absence of good institutions that one can fall back on, which again just cannot be emphasized enough for people that are coming from that background, when you don't have that in any sense to fall back on, and you're looking for something else, well, this is the natural thing to draw upon, is this natural historic background of Burmese Buddhist thinking that has historical precedents, that has spiritual precedents of great monks and the stories and the tribulations that they go through. Just to give one example, because I think this fits a lot of different modes, is that of what we're speaking to is the great lay meditation teacher Seyaji Ubaken, who was the teacher of S.N. Goenka, who started this whole movement. That there's a story early in Ubaken's life that he had an eye infection, and it was so serious that for 6 months he couldn't even go outside. He was a government minister under UNU, and he couldn't even go outside because the eye infection was so serious. And he was also a healer. He practiced healing on himself and on others, and he ended up eating, I think, something like a simple bowl of rice with beans and lentils that was salted, just like one bowl every day, and taking a vow of truth and meditating, of course. And through this kind of vow of truth that he made, and through his own supernatural abilities of being a meditation master, he was able to cure himself. And when I heard this story, and I was working on a book that was associated with Pariyati, which is a publishing house that's connected to Goenka, they were very concerned about this story, because this story really contradicted the way that meditation was being presented
Mm,
through their organizational teachings, which was that it's not to cure everyday ailments, it's not magical, it's not, this whole other
right.
thing, that it's this logical mind body kind of relation. So what in the world, our teacher's teacher, seemingly miraculously curing himself of an eye infection, where in the world does this fit into the paradigm of meditation that we're presenting? And I showed them the original source, and then I talked through the context, that this wasn't, this was completely within the context of everything I understood about Burmese monks and kings and rulers, and what that context was of facing a hard time and being austere, and taking these vows, and the place of victory and these other things. And with that, they, to their credit, they allowed it to remain in and be published with that background. But it highlighted, that story to me both highlights the misunderstanding of outside communities and the way things are presented to them, and then integrating with what's happening in a local context, as well as what that local context actually is and how that's
Yeah.
actually manifesting and coming about. So
No, I have a lot to say about that. I think it's really insightful. Maybe three things, if I can remember them after I start the first one, is that the first point is just, when you're not in there's no like unmarked third person, general subject who can present him or herself as like, I have these rights because I'm a citizen of Myanmar, right? And I think this speaks to the fact that the body becomes so important as the thing that can justify the incursion into the public sphere. People will, rather than pointing outside of the context to their standing as Myanmar citizens, they'll invert that and point to themselves, and sometimes literally point to the scars on their bodies, not the metaphorical ones, but they'll say, "You see this here?" I had one guy take his teeth out at one point to reveal a bunch of missing teeth, and he spoke about how this was given to him in prison, and he actually attributed it to Dan Shui, I think. And Goto, the main interlocutor and protagonist in the book, was continually talking about these liver ailments that he had and these ongoing health problems that he attributed to his many years in Dayawadi prison. And so these people could point to those bodies, their own bodies, as the thing that essentially, maybe not legitimates, because that's kind of like a word I tend to avoid, but at least like helps ground or justify what they're doing. And I think that points to all those, I guess, more immanent rather than transcendent paradigms that you're speaking about when you talk about the Azani and the Almier. Like it has to kind of emerge from within. But the Azani is really fascinating too in that sense, because people as I show in the book, are constantly fighting over what is the actual a correct Azani path. When is the culture of sacrifice truly sacrificial and for the people, and when is it actually just for your own glory? And one of the, even this activist group where one of the main leaders of it kept going to prison, one of the members of the group, Durain, who didn't go to a prison as much, but was very, I would almost say, contemptuous of the leader who kept going to prison, because he felt like this was not the appropriate sacrificial path. This was bringing him glory of, being able to say he was the one who kept going to prison, rather than doing what you need to do for the community. And so there's this sort of irony in which the thing that seems from the outside as very courageous was actually seen by Durain as a sort of almost cowardly act, the one that that shirks your responsibility, which is one of these themes that comes up a lot in the book. The activists constantly using this word dawun, of responsibility or duty, like who will take the responsibility, or I will take the responsibility for this. And so the Azani path and the true sacrifice becomes an object of anxiety and tension and contestation, rather than just one that you can easily invoke. And so that complicates the terrain even further, and I think makes things much more interesting, because it repoliticizes things. Otherwise, people could just be constantly, claiming their Azani, constantly claiming that they're the true sacrificient, whatever the word would be, and instead, activists were bringing it back to the politics, saying, well, what is actually helping our cause? Is this the time for us to get arrested? What are the pros and cons of making this choice right now? Is this a time where there are no other options than going back to prison? Or is it better to organize in the community?
Yeah, so we've been talking about some of the characteristics of the state and the way that plays out. And we've been kind of talking around the response to that and the potentialities of responses that have been studied. It's really one of the core features of your book. And so I think let's get into that directly. And the best way to get into that is to bring out the differentiation between the terms of resistance and refusal. You note the former are tactics and the latter are strategy. So can you contrast first the definition of these two terms and then contrast what these two terms mean in a real practical context of confronting state power in Myanmar?
Sure. So I think the turn to refusal has occurred in the literature, and I spent a lot of time reading these people who were bringing up refusal, who were highlighting the fact that resistance had kind of become dead, and I was wondering why this was, and I think what I came up with is a sort of re-theorization of resistance and refusal a little bit, and in the sense that resistance tends to be this like head-on confrontation with power, where there's a sort of mutual co-constitution of those entities that are facing off with each other. The sort of resistor and the thing that's being resisted kind of like come together in this contest. But that can be very dangerous for the reasons that I've described, as with a state that doesn't mind annihilating you. But I also wanted to highlight that it's also difficult in the context of a state that also doesn't always appear there. So not only is this a state that can annihilate you, but sometimes this is a state that isn't there. And one of the things that comes up a lot in the book are these moments when people are trying to mobilize against the state and find that it's just absent. And as a result, nothing is perhaps more depressing, or maybe, well, there probably are things, but it is quite depressing when you finally get the courage up to act and you hold your protest and it doesn't signify, right? You send in you get together all your data and you send in the letter to the state that says, our land was stolen, please give it back. And you don't even get a response that says, yeah, we don't care. The lack of care is so immense that incomplete that it doesn't even warrant a response. And so a lot of what I'm kind of characterizing as refusal are the sort of paradigm in which that direct contestation isn't foregrounded, but rather the sort of concern about promoting and organizing the biopolitical, the population group's life ends up becoming central, both so that they can ultimately forge acts of resistance that will signify, that will get a response, and also so that they're just able to continue to see or not, or maybe even suddenly see their lives as political. And this goes back to that earlier point about outside of the rights paradigm, everyone is a member of a population group. And one of the things that I actually found to be interesting about Myanmar is that it takes a heck of a lot of work to even construct yourself as a population group. So we would assume that if you don't fall into a liberal rights-bearing subject, then you're a part of this. You're a farmer, or you're a student, or you're a member of an ethnic group, or many of these things at the same time. But what I found is that a lot of these groups of farmers, for instance, who were writing letters to try to get their land back, were failing to kind of constitute themselves as population groups who could be listened to. So there's this sort of realm that falls outside of the population group, the sort of mass of humanity here in Myanmar, that takes a lot of organizing to get them to be able to make their claims on, in this case, the state, and get the state to consider giving redress. So a lot of the time spent during the field work period was sitting with farmers and going through their documents. This is the activists, and getting the chronology straight and rewriting their letters that they would send to the officials, and making sure the right people were copied, and making sure that they wrote them to index or to point to the fact that the activists were looking out for them, so they couldn't be so simply ignored. And so all this work that gets put into constituting the resisting subject is kind of what I describe as under the paradigm of refusal, all this extra stuff that might get missed, as we've been talking about throughout the podcast
Exactly.
today, if you only focus on those moments that they seem to pop up out of nowhere. And I think a lot of times, the weapons of the weak paradigm tends to presume that there's a public transcript that is spoken out loud and tends to be very obeisant. And underneath the surface, and I hope this isn't too patricidal of my mentor and dissertation committee member James C. Scott, who wrote about the public transcript and the hidden transcript, that he describes the hidden transcript as being pretty legible. Everyone kind of understands the conditions of their exploitation, and so when the political opportunity changes, then they're ready to snap into action. And he calls this infrapolitics, and talks about how these things, sometimes it is like wildfire when people who have been repressed then emerge. And I don't think that's untrue to describe some empirical situations, but in Myanmar, at least, it seemed like it took a lot more work to get people to understand their conditions as potentially political and actionable. And that, I think, is why I use this sort of refusal paradigm, because resistance seemed to presume a little bit too much about the resisting subject and about that as which is being resisted against. This, in this case, we might call it the state, with in air quotes, because the state is always much more complex than just that term.
One question of how this dynamic of how are you gearing up a population to fight back when they're just barely trying to survive with the level of poverty and other challenges that they're facing is one. And then another kind of weird contradictory dynamic that you're bringing up is this sense of how do you a state that ignores you except when they're punishing you, how do you somehow try to awaken the bear to manifest so that it so that you then can resist or repel it. And it's these contradictory things that I think it's a simplified view that has come on past conflicts in Myanmar and past touchstone points don't really recognize the complexity that is being dealt with. And on top of that, I'm wondering, in your study, I think that we definitely hold this sense of the military as being this big bad oppressor, that rightly so, given its conduct. But where does the transition years fit into this? And I know that what's often been argued that the NLD never really had proper power, that they couldn't do everything they wanted. They were also playing games to try to make sure what actually happened would not happen. And so that might be, so some of the things they were doing or not doing are sometimes attributed to the larger games they were trying to play. But in looking at how we know as the military is this, the regime in its present incarnation, as well as previous decades, as the kind of terror and horrible things and atrocities that they did, where this is definitely an oppressor that you have to look at how at where and how you resist and where and how you refuse. But then when the NLD comes in, how does that dynamic change in those policies that are coming out? And I'll just throw one thing out before I ask the question, because it just came to mind. We had one podcast guest we had on earlier was Bobo, who was a member of Generation Wave. And when I asked him this question, I love his answer. And I mean, I'm always quoting the wisdom of my guests to try to understand these points. And I'm very privileged to have all these conversations. But I love his answer. His answer was like, activists do what activists do and governments do what governments do. So like, even though the NLD was a better actor in many ways than the previous military, he made clear that like activists continue to do what activists do and governments continue to do what governments do. And that's the way we continue relating. And it wasn't quite so life-threatening or dire, but like, hey, that dynamic was there in the blood, and that it continued for what it was. And so I'm wondering also what you found when you looked at tactics and relationships as the governing body changed.
Yeah, a lot there. I mean, I can even start by saying that what you kind of point to is the fact that the state, in air quotes, is a tricky kind of entity to refer to in that sense, because I think Myanmar people tend to view many different levels of the state, and activists are able to operate because they understand that too. So
Hmm.
when they're interacting with a frontline, you know, police officer or local clerk, they don't see that in the same way as they would a general, which of course sounds kind of obvious, but in the sort of Weberian sense of the state as this sort of entity that operates to, um, homogeneously control space within a delimited territory, um, it it deserves pointing out that when they encounter that state agent, everything is in play. Like that person's stateness can be very easily displaced, and that actually is what allows these protests to exist in the first place. They will intimidate and threaten the local, police officer who comes and says, you can't be doing this. They'll say things like, I've gone, I've spent more time in prison than you've been alive. There are things that have been done to me that, everything that you can imagine has been done to me. So there's nothing that you can do to threaten me. And even when I retell those kind of stories, the hair bristles on the back of my neck because of the sort of the charged atmosphere that they're able to construct by referencing the history of their
Hmm.
own sacrifices, to go back to the
Hmm.
earlier point. And as a result, it's not like they immediately turn that local official into a committed revolutionary, but what usually is enacted is a sort of willingness for that official to maybe call usually his superiors, or to at least allow the action to go on for a little while before intervening. And that gives the activists the space to create this sort of what I call schematically in the book, these horizontal actions, or actions with horizontal effects, where actions against the state would be vertical ones, kind of up to the state, using these spatial metaphors that I know as an anthropologist I'm supposed to eschew, but I'm relying on it because I think it helps people visualize. These horizontal actions kind of help communicate with people who are like, oh, this is interesting. We don't see this every day. This is definitely different than what I'm used to. Maybe I should pay attention and see what the message is. Um, so then the state is always a little bit disaggregated, as it's seen through the actions of activists and normal people. And as you rightly say, it then changes significantly with the transition. I remember coming back to Yangon in 2016 after the election, because I had gone back to New York to write up my dissertation. I kind of expected the activists who I work with to be really excited about this new era that was dawning, and they were more depressed than I had ever seen them. They had talked about calling up
Hmm.
their contacts at the NLD and said, okay, like, what do we do? How do we go to work, reorganize this society that is so out of whack? And the transition years were also, I think, this is something I haven't mentioned yet, and I really don't want to neglect it, is the way the political economy was changing during these years. Not immediately after 2011. I think it started probably in 1990 after the SLORC replaced the BSPP. But you had this sort of neoliberalization of the political economy that made daily life a lot more precarious for people. And so you had this vertiginous feeling in which wealth was accumulating, and there were signs of it in a place like Yangon with glittering shopping malls and new cars, but people were having their lands grabbed and not getting their land back, and finding it harder to reproduce themselves at a daily level. The landless were much worse off, and migration was becoming even more intensive and exploitative as people found themselves like pushed out to these natural resource extraction zones that used up the land and used up their own bodies before they had to go on to the next ones. And so there was this ambiguity and feelings of ambivalence that occurred in the transition, in which the activists felt like they had a lot to offer because they had been organizing in these local communities for a long time. And they said, okay, so what do we do to make sure that this transition is just for all? And they received message back, quote, like from the lady herself, but who knows if it actually came from her, but basically saying like, you guys played your part, you did your thing. your role is silent now, and as she once famously put it when she was asked why the NLD was running candidates who were, from Yangon in constituencies far, far away, she told the complaining public, your role is to vote for the flag, and we will
Mm.
take responsibility for actually governing, which I think
Uh-huh.
speaks to her imperious and authoritarian understanding of what democracy is. It's very much not a people's democracy, but rather an elite technocratic one in which the smart people look out for the people who are benighted and not quite smart enough to look out for themselves. And this was anathema to the activists. And so after going through a period of time where they wanted to give the NLD a chance to make better decisions when it came to engaging the grassroots, both at the level of policy, but also at the level of, taking advantage of this really strong muscle that had been built over the years for people to look after themselves and the activist work that had been done. They eventually said, to kind of go back to Bobo, activists are going to do what they do. And so they proceeded to do all the things they did by trying to hold the NLD to account for the version of itself that they thought it could be. Now, this did kind of like change the way that they refused or resisted or whatever term we want to use a little bit, because it tended to be, they wanted to give the NLD a chance, and I think they were probably less radical at that period than they certainly are being right now. But at the same time, they were, able to focus on the things that they knew were, the challenges that weren't being addressed. And so this is land grabs, this is daily life in the peri-urban zones, and this is, industrial actions and strikes that occurred in the factories in which people were being treated really, really poorly. And I think, to go to your broader point about whether the transition was cursed from the start because of this diarchic relationship, this sort of split relationship between the military and the NLD trying to govern and no one really having trouble. One of the things I was most struck by in the coup was how this diarchy had actually seemed to kind of meld into a singular kind of elite rule and a sort of what I called in an article with Pyo and Lat, who's a historian who's based in Yangon now, a sort of consolidation of a certain kind of class consciousness on the part of sort of bourgeois elites, whether they be of the military, the red or the green. And I think what was most striking about the coup is the way that the military was willing to undermine that relationship for other goals that I think are still kind of inscrutable and could boil down to, if activists are going to activists and governments are going to govern, maybe military men are going to military. And there's a sort of libidinal desire to for the contest and for war that can't be underestimated. And I think, of course, complicates rational or sort of kind of classically rational analyses of why the coup occurred.
Right. So from here, I'd like to go to a point that you brought up in the very start of the conversation. We didn't go there right away, partly because there were other directions and partly because I thought it was rich to explore some of these things first and have the context for then going into what is such a rich and important topic. And that is how so much of your book is looking at linguistic differences and how they're playing a role in cultural conceptions of political and civil understandings. And perhaps there's no more important word to begin with than the English word rights. And you did go into this at the beginning. You broke this down and talked about the different translations and where responsibility comes and the kind of vagueness and nuance of what things could mean. But I think it's important to revisit this and invest a bit more time, given the context that we've now covered leading up to this. If you can remind us and go into some detail of the various ways that the English word rights can be relayed in Burmese according to different contexts, different meanings, different connotations, and those different interpretations that they carry.
Sure. Thank you for that opportunity. I think I also will preface this by talking a little bit about my own linguistic acumen, or rather lack thereof. And perhaps this is just on my mind because I was in KL the last couple of days conducting fieldwork in Burmese, a huge number of Burmese speakers in Malaysia, by the way, which I
Mm.
hadn't expected until I moved here. And this is for a
Mhm.
second project on Rohingya lives in the sort of diaspora as they've been forced out of Myanmar. But I was lamenting the way my own Burmese has slipped. But I also don't want to overstate my linguistic abilities, and I think the way that I was taught inadequate as a Burmese speaker actually kind of felicitously brought up some kind of interesting cross-linguistic insights,
Mhm.
because I often had people toggling for my benefit between Burmese and their version of English, and I was able to hear some of these weird ways that English words were used that made me think, oh, maybe this word that I think has a stable content is actually being used in quite different ways. So to give an example, one day, Goto said to me, "Oh, tonight I just checked. Tonight you will have the right to meet with Soong." And I was very confused because Soong, a
Mm.
lovely person, but not a particularly like eminent one,
Mm.
whose
Uh-huh.
schedule is very is one would need a right to actually visit him. And so I
Mhm.
think what I realized in that moment, and then Goto and I talked about it for a long time afterwards, is that his brain kind of like was thinking in Burmese, if you will, and had kind of thought about akwinye, this term that can mean rights or opportunities. And so then he translated it into English and it came out as rights, even though in my mind, opportunity would have been more appropriate. And I think like those are the kind of, my ears were perked. My ears were, kind of attuned to those linguistic uses, and
Mm.
I tried to kind of construct what we call a corpus of sort of language in use that showed all the not all, but many of the different ways that some of these terms could be used, and then try to derive some conclusions from them. And so to go back to the kind of overarching point, one of the things I found was that the phrase acquint, which uses that root quint, which can mean as much as an entitlement and as little as like a permission or a chance, tends to translate into this term that I kind of describe as rights/opportunities, because it's difficult to really call them one or the other. And depending on who uses them, they will shift along that maybe spectrum, we could say. So I remember talking to Ivan Pun, the son of the Serge Pun, who owns much of Yangon and Langtaya, and him telling me, there's no problem with rule of law, there's no problem with rights in Myanmar. And I remember thinking in reflection later, well, yeah, from his class position, he must see things that way. And I think
Yeah.
things can solidify into something that approximates what we might call a right when you're constantly experiencing things as a right. And this is where I use what I call in the book the semiotic anthropological paradigm, which I think is in a sense, like, it sounds more intimidating than it needs to. It just means
Mhm.
that where we sometimes tend to think of things descriptive, like we describe a situation as, the law says this or the law says that, a semiotic paradigm, or maybe just an anthropological one, will pay attention to what actually happens, and looks at the way that the outcomes of different interactions in the world then sediment through repeated interactions and experiences into a sort of worldview. So Ivan Pun was experiencing his world as being one with pretty stable expectations of things that could happen to him. That kind of like almost becomes a right. But when you get something now, but the next time you don't get it, and the third time you don't get it, and the fourth, then to describe something as a right seems to almost fall apart in terms of your experiential understanding of something. And one of the things as I put it in the book, how many times does a rule have to be broken before it breaks forever? The fourth time, the fifth time, can you continue to be told you have rights but not actually experience them? Can you still
Mhm.
believe in rights as this sort of transcendent paradigm that operates outside of the context of use? And I argue that in Myanmar, you don't. And I spend a time in chapter 5, I believe, of the book, kind of showing this long history of experience with power in Myanmar, and show how even though terms like acquitté are used and translated sometimes in important documents, whether they are constitutions or land laws, as rights in English and vice versa, people will hear that term and reflect upon their own lives and say, well, this seems a lot more like opportunity than it does as a right. What are the sort of conditions and contexts that would need to exist for this opportunity to materialize? And if I don't have those contexts and conditions, then perhaps this opportunity is not for me. This opportunity is for someone else, someone who's luckier, someone who has more privileges already, who can enjoy these kinds of things. And so in the book, I look at all these different contexts and examples, hopefully less interviews and more kind of engagements between Burmese people themselves as they talk these things out. And there's like a particularly brutal example late in the book where different Myanmar Muslim and Rohingya people are talking about fighting against the 1982 citizenship law, and one of the characters is talking about fighting for rights, and another character says, why are you talking? We're the most exploited and marginalized minority in the country. We can't go out here and demand things like rights. We are the beggar in the corner. If a beggar demands rights, they're more likely to get kicked than to get any food. I'm paraphrasing it right now. We need to be a little bit more reasonable about what we can expect. And so, gosh, this is like quite affecting for me.
Yeah.
You can see how it cuts both ways. And what I mean by that is that by evoking rights that you don't yet have, you can perform them into existence. And that's one of the really amazing things about rights claims. And I think one of the reasons why theorists like Judith Butler and Jacques Rancière highlight the ability of these paradigms to be appropriated by people to whom they don't yet belong and used and say, like, look, we belong too. We can claim these things the same way that you were able to. Why are we excluded? But at the same time, as this anecdote highlights, there's a risk in claiming things which you don't yet have. There's a risk in claiming a right and then exposing yourself to the failure of that right that just reinforces the position that you perhaps haven't performed your way out of yet. And it also risks the reactionary violence as people are seen as claiming rights they don't have. And this was something that came up again and again in my time asking about and looking at discourse on the Rohingya conflict. And of course, there's a huge amount of just plain old-fashioned racism on the part of Myanmar people towards Muslim individuals and Rohingya in particular. But it was very interesting how often it was couched in the terms of taking a Quintier that they didn't deserve. So rather than seeing this as a conflict in which these are people who are being slaughtered, or these are people who are having citizenship rights denied, and it seems very basic to give them these things. Many times I saw Myanmar people describe the Rohingya as essentially skipping the queue, jumping in line, as a famous Mau Mau Fountain cartoon had it, in which there were all these other problems in the country, and the Rohingya were focalizing their own and risking the sort of upending the transition as a result. And I was lucky enough to work with people who were aggressively anti-racist and worked with Muslim communities in Mandalay and Yangon, in these sort of ad hoc that then became more institutionalized protection schemes that emerged when rumors would circulate, and they would go out onto the streets and say, hey, everyone, think about who benefits from this kind of violence, and think about your neighbors, your Muslim neighbors. Do you think they actually did this, or is this the black hand behind the scenes operating? But even they had a sort of contempt, or at least a sort of suspicion about Rohingya, because they said, well, where are the Rohingya in the streets? Where are they working with us? Where are they working for the broader people? They're only working for themselves. And of course, that was a huge blind spot, because the Rohingya were excluded from participating and then being blamed for their own exclusion, essentially. But it does kind of speak to the fact that alternative idioms than rights can be used, but only if you're given the opportunity to use them. And the Rohingya were stuck in this really tough situation in which they were so far outside of sort of seen as so far outside of Burmese kind of cultural life and experience, they weren't really able to develop those bonds of solidarity. And there's so many reasons for that hopefully I'll get into in another book. And so to loop back to make one final point about the linguistic stuff that I think bears a little bit of emphasis is that there have been many critiques of rights that have existed in critical literature. And when I describe this book as a critique of rights, I can almost feel like my interlocutors rolling their eyes, like, "Oh, we need another one of those."
Mm.
But what I think, two things that I tried to really focus on here that I think makes this a little bit more interesting than a classic, like this isn't the appropriate paradigm for a post-colonial population. And the first is the sort of linguistic analysis in which I was by attending closely to how people talked about things like Acquaintier and how the sort of grammar and syntax that they used, I was able to compare that with the grammar and the syntax of the way that people maybe, said advisedly, the West talk about rights. And one of the things I found quite striking is how often people in the West will describe their rights as possessions, and not just as
Mm-hmm.
possessions, but as inalienable possessions. So possessions
Mm-hmm.
that they have, even when their rights are being denied to them. And think
Right.
no further than the Beastie Boys talking about you have to fight for your right to party,
Right.
which I think I slipped into a footnote in the book. Um, and this is something that's been identified in the literature. It's called the possession paradox. How can you possess something that you don't have? But I don't think people take the weirdness of this very seriously enough. And I think what the comparative method can do is throw into relief how something we take for granted, fighting for your rights that you don't have at this moment, is so strange when you look at Burmese grammar and syntax, where they don't talk about rights that way. Rights are much more alienable possessions. They're not like arms and mothers that when you lose them, you still talk about them as if they are yours.
Mm-hmm.
So if my mother dies, she's still my mother. My mother
Mm-hmm.
is doing very well, quite wonderful person.
Mm-hmm.
My arm is mine even after it
Mm-hmm.
gets severed in a car accident because it's so important to my very being as
Uh-huh.
a person. No, my rights are so important to me as a political person in America that I would describe, my rights being denied. Now, Burmese people, and of course there's exceptions, and so this is not unequivocal. But I find alternative ways of describing rights or acquaintier in Burmese. Rights can be stolen. They can be carried off. You can get more rights than someone else, rather than everyone having equal number of rights, an equal amount of rights, and just having their access to those rights denied. And as a result, I think because Burmese people also don't talk about them as inalienable, as connected to their person, they also don't vocalize them as much. And so this is another kind of intervention, which is to remind people that describing the political world as organized through this particular political technology of rights is not necessarily how people use them. And I think we can gain a lot by looking at alternative ways that they use these phrases.
Yeah, so there's a lot there and things I was going to pick up on. Certainly that story with the Muslims and when that you quote where they seem to have a choice between when they're looking at how they can gain more protection or integrate more into society, that they have this choice between either demanding rights or drawing pity, and that this dynamic and looking at how they should proceed, that it seems that trying to claim their rights or voice out their rights is more threatening than trying to draw pity so that they're not harmed. But then you go into describing some of the circumstances around that, the right to claim, you have a right to claim and not a right to have,
Yeah.
that this sense of cutting in line, that there's a cartoon that you feature in the book about different groups that are cutting in line to get what's theirs from the state, from those that maybe have more of they feel they have more of a right to those services. But the
Hmm.
phrase that really stood out to me in the book, and that you just talked about now as well, is that you talk about how rights are not considered inalienable in Myanmar. And that really struck me. It struck me. I'm having almost like a mental block. Like when I read it and when you were talking now, it's like no matter how many times I hear this point, I can't quite. There's something in my mind that's not grasping it. And I think the reason why is that I'm so used to the collocation of in English of inalienable rights. That's just something we always say together, inalienable rights. That if you bring up the thought experiment that rights might be alienable, I don't even know what alienable means, because I'm so used to this understanding of inalienable rights. It's almost like if someone were to ask me what's the opposite of disheveled, like I don't know. Disheveled is just it's not shoveled. Like I don't know. So like I never even really knew alienable was a word, because it was like inalienable rights. That's the way I think about it. And so it's just, and we talk about coming from stable societies and trying to understand different different functions and ways that states operate away from our own. And certainly, the lack of a trust in state institutions is something that I never could have understood conceptually, and even not being as impacted as a member of that society in all the years it took me to really understand what the product and consequence was of state institutions that weren't functioning the way that I had always assumed they basically should. Same thing with this. It's conceptually very hard for me to understand how a right cannot be inalienable. This is just something I'm grown up thinking. But one of the frameworks that you present, which is not new to your book and has been referenced in terms of Myanmar, and is such an insightful and yet tragic understanding to come to, is this conception that rights in Myanmar can be seen as finite. And I think that's something that we can
Yeah.
grasp conceptually, even if we don't haven't lived through it. I mean, that's very different from this sense
Yeah.
that there's only so much to go around. There's only so much of this commodity. That's a very new thought. It's a thought I understand, unlike inalienable rights, which I still, or alienable rights, which I still don't really understand. I can't really wrap my mind around how that actually feels and how that looks. I can understand, as tragically as it is, that there's this sense that there are, that rather than rights being this natural phenomenon that exists, that we all should have access to and should honor and should ensure that the people unlike us have the same privileges and access and rights that we do, taking that understanding and changing it instead to there's a finite number of how one can be safe and protected from the state and have rights and privileges within that state, that there's only so much to go around. It's not very much, and it needs to be claimed aggressively and with shrewdness and with different strategies, and kind of these clever different approaches that can swipe in and take something before the other person does. And okay, this might not be the best way, but this is the system we're all playing, so you don't play, you lose.
Yeah.
But there's this finite group there, and that that someone else is going to get it if you don't. And so that's where the cutting in line analogy comes, that if you're waiting in line for this finite resource, which happens to be rights, and by whatever feature, international media attention, or some highlight on some minority group, that they're going to swoop in and take something which you have been waiting patiently for. And this is such a foreign way of understanding for me, and maybe for some listening, that there is this sense that there is a finite number of rights to go around, and because it's finite, you'd better get what's yours, and you'd better make sure that your family, your community, your group gets what's yours before others. And this is as important as it is to understand this. I guess the question comes: what do you do with this? Can you hope to
Yeah.
change it, or how do you work within it, or maybe you don't come with a predominant view of one's view of rights being something you're trying to convert to. But I don't know, is it something you try to convert people to, if you see it as a greater good in the world? I don't know how I think first is just understanding the truth that it is subjectively, it is seen as a finite thing, and not denying that or battling against that. But then once you see that for what it is, where do you go from there? How do you, because if it's a zero sum game, it's never going to end up good. So, and if activists are also bringing this understanding, where do you go in trying to create a more equitable society? It's hard to wrap your mind around.
Yeah, I mean, you've kind of outlined like the sort of what is at stake in this, and I think that the finite rights that you describe, I think, can sometimes be well conveyed through an a concept that comes from economics. Oddly enough, economics can be helpful sometimes. And that's the idea of a public good. And a public good, described technically, is something that's non-rival, right? So like my use of it doesn't impede your use of it, and non-excludable, like the extra person accessing it doesn't matter. And it's very difficult to exclude someone. So think about something like national defense. The extra person who is defended by the military, who's keeping the bad guys out, if we can accept that thought experiment, doesn't really affect the ability to keep the bad guys out, and no one can be excluded from it. I can't decide to have the gun not shoot this person, or like air. Air is a nice public good, right? Everyone can use it. No one can be excluded from it, and the extra person using it doesn't affect it. And so we kind of imagine rights in that sense, is that everyone enters the set of citizens who enjoy the rights that are theirs as part of being citizens, and then the extra person who enters into the system doesn't affect anyone else's, and no one can be excluded from it. Now we kind of know that it hasn't been the history, and as you describe, all historically marginalized populations have been increasingly incorporated into this paradigm, at least at the level of de jure or maybe a symbolic recognition as being folks who can be brought into the fold. And the question is, what do we gain by perceiving a system that operates otherwise, in terms of finite resources and finite rights, where people see the extra person entering the system as threatening the ability for me to realize it, and wants to devise ways to exclude an extra person from actually using these things. Now, I'll start by saying that I wonder how different that alternative dystopian system actually is to, you've used the phrase stable societies that in the West. And I think like one of the things that makes one of the objectives of the book is to try to show this thing that seems quite different than our conventional wisdom at this situation adhering in Myanmar, and then use that to make strange the system, that the conventional wisdom itself, back in those supposedly stable societies. And I wonder how stable they are. And I think there's a sort of disjuncture between the rhetoric and the discourse and the symbolic realm and the de jure realm, all these things that describe the way things are supposed to be, and then how things play out on the ground. And so I wonder, is our Myanmar and the United States, for instance, more alike than they would seem? Are rights more like opportunities in America than we would want to acknowledge? And so, and this goes back to the political economy point as well. So as you have more and more people being incorporated at the level of like the symbolic level or the de jure level, yes, more rights for historically marginalized groups. That's a sort of incorporative aspect. The same time, this machine is, as it's incorporating more and more people, it's also spewing others out. It's ejecting others from the realm of those who can actually realize those rights. And I argue in the conclusion that this kind of generates a particularly weird kind of ennui or frustration, in which we have been kind of habituated into using this particular way of describing our relationships with power, through this technology of rights. And as you describe it, it's hard to think outside of the paradigm of inalienable rights. But then if we look at the way that our lives sometimes play out, and we can, compare those lives with people who have more class or racial privilege or gender privilege or sexual privilege than the rest, then we can ask, am I realizing these entitlements, and am I accessing these resources because of rights, or because, as an unmarked citizen the same way someone else is, or are these merely special club goods, to go back to the public good speak, special things that I get to access because I'm a member of this special club within the club, I'm in my case, a cis white man of high class status, when I am able to walk into a public building, and I'm able to get the state to do the things it's supposed to do, when I encounter it at the Department of Motor Vehicles or the Customs Department when I come back in the country, am I accessing those things because I'm just a citizen, just like any other one, or am I benefiting from privilege? And I think it's an interesting mix of those things. And so then the question becomes, what do we gain or lose by holding on to a rights paradigm in a context where it seems like perhaps not, we have to completely throw it out the window, but it seems like the rights themselves are decreasingly doing some of the work. And I think it cuts both ways. I think it can be liberating, but it also can be perhaps demobilizing. So when people, and this goes back to the Myanmar fieldwork, when people know that they don't have a right to something, it takes a lot more work to get them to mobilize for it, because it's dangerous to fight for something you don't have, and it can make things worse for you, as illustrated in the anecdote about the Muslim Burmese person who described themselves as the beggar who shouldn't demand rights, risk getting kicked as a result. So it can be demobilizing in that sense, but it can also be dangerous in the sense that outside of a rights paradigm, you have these civil society mobilizations that aren't always very pretty, that aren't always ones that we want to endorse as being wonderfully outside of the state and hence laudable for that reason. Like Mabata and other right-wing Buddhist movements are kind of like civil society movements that are able to flourish outside of the rights paradigm. And you could quite profitably analyze them as being devoted to stripping belonging to other members of the polity and reformulating one along much narrower and more exclusionary lines. So those are certainly the risks. But they're liberating in the sense that, it does provide people with a sort of compelling them or encouraging them to think improvisationally and to think about all the different things you can and need to do to change the conditions that are before you. Because if, outside of a rights paradigm or within a paradigm in which, improvisation is possible, victories might never be forever achieved, but losses aren't forever either. And so I sometimes observe actions in the West kind of sometimes resorting to or devolving into people getting mad that they didn't get their rights and then going home and complaining about it. But when you don't ever presuppose you have rights in the first place, you never get caught in that kind of downward spiral of demobilization. You know that if you want something, you kind of have to go out and create it. So it takes a lot more work, but it can be hopeful at the same time. I think that there was this speaks to this moment that occurred in America with, making America great again, this nostalgic moment to go back to a point where people were enjoying privileges that they hadn't earned, and they were benefiting from the sort of outcomes of occupying and displacing a native population, and benefiting from the vestiges of a political economy based on colonialism and slavery. And so as a result, this past that people want to go back to was essentially, as you say, coddled by a particular set of accidents of history. And the rest of the world looks at that with, I think, appropriate levels of derision.
Yeah, so we're in the middle of this conversation looking at rights, and this is a big topic, a thorny topic, and even giving what I thought might be adequate time towards not the very end of the interview. I think it's probably been about 45 minutes or so. We've just been on this subject of rights, but it's there in how important it is, and also the distinctions that have to be made between these different cultural conceptions of rights that we're still getting into, that we there's still some ways to go, as well as topics outside of this that I've written down in my notes from a book that's just chock full of points that, again, recommend listeners to check out. Rights Refused is the name of it, to be able to dig into this in depth. But I think what I would suggest is pausing here, because we've been going with some great momentum and it's been wonderful. But once we're past the 2-hour mark, I think our minds, as well as the minds of our listeners, might be losing some of that sharpness. And so I propose to put a bookmark where we are now and look at coming back and being able to pick up some of these topics as well as additional topics in a second part to this conversation and continue.
Great. I really welcome that. I've loved this conversation, and I would appreciate to continue it later. Thank you so much.
For whatever reason, even as the conflict in Myanmar continues to worsen, it somehow continues to be shut out of the Western media news cycle. And even when the foreign media does report on the conflict, it's often presented as a reductionist, simplistic caricature that inhibits a more thorough understanding of the situation. In contrast, our podcast platform endeavors to portray a much more authentic, detailed, and dynamic reality of the country and its people, one that nurtures deeper understanding and nuanced appreciation. Not only do we ensure that a broad cross-section of ideas and perspectives from Burmese guests regularly appear on our platform, but we also try to bring in foreign experts, scholars, and allies who can share from their experience as well. But we can't continue to produce at this consistency and at the level of quality we aim for without your help. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranam